Good morning from New York. I'm Chris Hayes. With only 3 days left before Election Day, a new NBC News Wall Street Journal Marist poll out this morning shows President Barack Obama leading Mitt Romney in Ohio by 6 points among likely voters. The poll also shows President Obama with a narrow lead in Florida, where the race stands at 49 to 47% among likely voters. We'll be talking more about Ohio and the Republican freakout over polling analysis later in the program. Right now, joining me at the table this morning, we have Michael Moynihan, cultural news editor for Newsweek and the Daily Beast, Esther Arma, host of WBAI FM's Wake Up Call, my colleague John Nichols, Washington correspondent for The Nation magazine, and Betsy Stevenson, columnist for Bloomberg View, associate professor at the Ford School, University of Michigan, and former chief economist at the Obama Labor Department, and mom to the 3-week-old Oliver. Congratulations. That's really awesome. Yay. All right. It has been 5 days since Sandy came ashore the East Coast as a post-tropical cyclone. The exact location of landfall didn't much matter because this was a 1,000-mile wide storm that inundated the country's most populous area. At least 109 people are known to have died in the storm here in the U.S. Another 69 were killed by Sandy in the Caribbean. As of this morning, about 2.5 million customers remain without power across 15 states and Washington, D.C. The most recent estimates have economic losses for the storm nearing $50 billion. The flooding of New York subways and commuter train tunnels and loss of business accounts for much of that estimate. With an election just a few days away, the political media industrial complex briefly ground to a halt and then somewhat awkwardly cranked back to life, with Mitt Romney turning a campaign event into a relief rally, President Obama heading back out on the trail, and pundits growing more and more comfortable speculating about the electoral consequences of the disaster. But it's a different story for local and state officials in areas ravaged by the storm. They've had to make practical decisions, give emergency briefings, and address the anxiety of their citizens. On Fox News, the day after Sandy hit, Republican New Jersey Governor Chris Christie seemed to suggest he wasn't taking the election into consideration.
Is there any possibility that Governor Romney may go to New Jersey to tour some of the damage with you?
I have no idea, nor am I the least bit concerned or interested. Right. I've got a job to do here in New Jersey that's much bigger than presidential politics, and I could care less about any of that stuff. The president was great last night. He said he would get it done. At 2 a.m., I got a call from FEMA to answer a couple of final questions, and then he signed the declaration this morning. So I have to give the president great credit. He's been on the phone with me 3 times in the last 24 hours. He has been very attentive, and anything that I've asked for, he's gotten to me. So I thank the president publicly for that. He has done, as far as I'm concerned, a great job for New Jersey.
New York City Mayor Michael Bloomberg last night canceled tomorrow's New York City Marathon after critics said the resources were needed elsewhere. After I tweeted about it, can't help but think that pushed him over the edge. Bloomberg said controversy over an athletic event should not distract attention from the storm recovery. Bloomberg also made news on Thursday when he endorsed Barack Obama for president, writing that Sandy, quote, brought the stakes of Tuesday's election into sharp relief. I thought what happened this week and the interactions between the president, Chris Christie, and Michael Bloomberg are really interesting. I thought the way we think about politics and disaster was brought into relief. We're going to talk about the substance. We're going to talk about seawalls and flood walls and climate change and what we have to do to think, how we have to reconceptualize our society and think about disaster in the future. But first, I want to talk about the politics of it because I thought the response to Christie's actions on the right and generally in the media I thought were fascinating. Maybe I'm alone in this. I didn't think he seemed to be doing anything out of the ordinary. It seemed to me like this was more or less politics as usual, that the president, when there's a disaster-stricken area, the president goes and the governor and they go look at this, the damage, and even from different parties, they put them aside for the moment, and people freaked out. And I think the freak out to me highlighted how much there's been this norm created on the Republican Party of just total implacable opposition at all times, so that Christie seemed like a betrayal. Now, the other argument is that Christie really has been going out of his way to throw Mitt Romney under the bus. I'm curious what you guys think about it.
I'll take a shot. You suggested the political media industrial complex ground to a halt. That's ridiculous. The political media industrial complex was whirling even as the storm was coming in. I heard everybody in all the campaigns talking about what impact is this going to have. And so by the nature of it, they were looking for something. And Chris Christie gave it to him. Now, part of it is that Chris Christie loves the camera. Right? I mean, he is the Giuliani of this moment. He's doing press conferences. He's physically out there, not sleeping, very present. But the key on that one is this is the keynote speaker of the Republican National Convention. It's not just any governor. He's one of the most known Republicans in the country. He's the guy who was supposed to make the case for Romney and forgot to mention him. And when he took that question, he could easily have said, look, I think Governor Romney's got other things to do. I'm pleased with it. Instead, you listen to that clip. It went on and on and on, and it built toward a crescendo of, I think the president is doing a great job for New Jersey.
And Chris Christie also, I would say, not only convention speaker, the great hope of many Republicans. Ann Coulter said he should be drafted. Rupert Murdoch wanted to pull him in the race, and then Rupert Murdoch's tweeting yesterday, basically, Christie has to come out hard for Obama in the next few days, or
for Romney.
For Romney in the next few days, or it is his responsibility to disaster the next 4 years.
I think there's an interesting thing about this with Chris Christie and on the Fox and Friends thing, is that there has been a narrative with Christie that there's something disingenuous about him. That a lot of this is a very stagey thing, that he, shouts down reporters in press conferences. I think that what we see here is that this is actually Chris Christie. I mean, this is the way he is in such a way. And so I think that, when he believes that the president is being attentive and doing a good job for the people of New Jersey, and that he doesn't care, and he's going to mow the people on Fox. He's going to mow anyone about this. And I was actually rather impressed with this. And, at the end of all this, he actually did get a mention from Bruce Springsteen, who he's a big fan of and who has denounced him. And he's actually said in a concert, this is true, and said, the governor has been
someone said some conservative that I follow on Twitter said, well, that's what this was all about. He said it wasn't about, it's not about Mitt Romney.
Do anything to get that shout out from the boss.
But I think there's just an issue of thinking about why is it that the public doesn't. The public would not tolerate a Republican governor saying, I am not going to accept money from the federal government to help get the lights back on. We will suffer through this as a state and eschew, any help. I mean, people wouldn't stand for that, but they will stand for it when that help is about something that's a little bit less immediate, right? So if a Republican governor says, we're turning down this money to fix our schools or to fix our unemployment
insurance, or to build high-speed rail,
internet. When a Republican governor turns that money down, people don't see the immediate consequences, and so they don't seem to react. But imagine what they would do if Chris Christie had stood up and said, we're not taking Obama's help on this.
I think it's two things. I think that it's absolutely Christie actually being who he is. I don't think that whole idea that he was being totally phony is fair. But I also think that Christie has been the attack dog for President Obama specifically, and so his kind of effusive praise seemed really shocking on the one hand. But I also think that truth has been such a casualty when it comes to the way the Republicans have run their political campaign. And Christie being the number one man for Romney, you put those two things together and suddenly it feels like he's on this political campaign for President Obama with literally days before the campaign.
Right, and I think that's partly because we have this kind of which side are you on feeling down the stretch of this. I agree with you, Michael, about Christie's. I've never thought he was staged. I thought that when he yelled at teachers at town halls, he was being authentically jerky. Like I didn't think that was stagecraft. I thought he was being a jerk,
unpleasant person.
Truly a jerk in a totally honest way.
And his compassion and his emotionality, and even saying that this is not about politics right now. Of course, it's always going to be about politics. But even that point, I think, came from a very specific, genuine space. He's an emotional politician. Mm-hmm. So what he articulates comes from that very specific place.
We live in a time where everybody's a pundit.
Yes.
Right? You walk in.
Wants to be one.
The person no, they're better than most of us. The person in the coffee shop, wants to talk about, especially right before an election.
Totally.
And this is something that happens in America. Most Americans, unlike we abnormal characters, can shut off politics for a lot of the time.
Right.
But when you're in the week before an election, everybody's going to look at it. And the fascinating thing is, we think we have to explain Chris Christie. Most Americans looked at Chris Christie. They know he's a big Republican. They know all these dynamics. And I think they saw him standing there saying what they wanted him to say, especially at a point where polling shows like 80% of Americans really would like to have a little bit of rapprochement. And then to have Michael Bloomberg come in the next day, roughly, and say, look, this thing tipped me. I'm voting for Obama. I mean, this is a dynamic that is really significant in our politics.
And what I think is fascinating is that, of course, one of the key arguments Barack Obama made in 2008, right, was that he was going to be the person that brought together red and blue. And Republicans have, I think, very wisely chosen a strategy of sort of constant, implacable opposition that has made it impossible for him to fulfill that promise. And the irony now is that Mitt Romney, who spent most of the campaign and during the primary telling jokes about what a terrible place Massachusetts was, bragging about all his vetoes, basically saying this place is this sort of sodomite hell that I come from, that he now is now using it. He is now using Massachusetts and the fact that he had this overwhelmingly, Democratic majority that he had to deal with as evidence that he actually is the person who could work across the aisle. So there's this sort of fascinating campaign down the stretch about who could work most across the aisle. Betsy, you made a really important point about the role of government at these moments, and I think that's the other kind of subtext here. And I want to talk about that and the kind of ideological subtext of politics and disaster after this break. Betsy, you made a great point before going to break about what this highlights about the role of government. And I think we tend to have certain scripts in the wake of disaster. First of all, I think there's this back and forth about not politicizing it. And I understand a certain impulse, right, which is that you want to not destroy feelings of social solidarity by basically turning people against each other over partisan lines. At the same time, disasters are inherently fundamentally political because they reveal the power relations of a society, and the power relations of the society are what constitutes politics in that society. And you talked about the role of government. Obviously, the role of government has been this kind of leitmotif throughout the campaign. The New York Times wrote an editorial in the wake of the storm saying a big storm needs big government. I think there's a general feeling that these are the times when we want the state to come in and do things. And people have been pointing out this response Mitt Romney gave talking about FEMA, the Federal Emergency Management Agency, back in June during a Republican debate. Take a look.
FEMA's about to run out of money, and there are some people who say do it on a case-by-case basis, and some people who say, maybe we're learning a lesson here that the states should take on more of this role. How do you deal with something like that?
Absolutely. Every time you have an occasion to take something from the federal government and send it back to the states, that's the right direction. And if you can go even further and send it back to the private sector, that's even better. We should take all of what we're doing at the federal level and say, what are the things we're doing that we don't have to do? And those things we've got to stop doing because we're borrowing $1.6 trillion more this year than we're taking in.
Romney's campaign, in sort of customary fashion afterwards, seemed to walk that back and say we're not going to privatize FEMA, send it to the states. Michael, as the libertarian at the table, what's your feeling? Should he have come back and doubled down on this and said yes, FEMA should be in the private sector of the states?
Well, no, I mean obviously he's back in his heels in this. I mean, and it's not necessarily kind of a libertarian issue in the sense that, like, after there was a lot of anger about this and this quote was circulating, and there's a piece in the Atlantic said, well, look, he's not trying to defund FEMA. There's this idea of bringing it to states and everything. Should he have doubled down? No, I don't think he should have. And this is purely political calculation. I'm not saying that.
No, but I'm asking from an ideological perspective. Yeah. I agree. Politically, it would have been suicidal for him to be like, yes, in fact, what is FEMA? I don't know what that means. Sure. No, but I'm asking a deeper ideological question, which is my knee-jerk liberal response to this, which confirms my priors, right? Which is that we need the state to do this kind of thing. Is that wrong?
You're just setting me up here.
No, I genuinely want to know.
Look, I think that there are an enormous number of problems with FEMA. One does not have to look very far online to look for people who know this stuff very well and say that this is a hugely dysfunctional organization for a number of reasons. Is the solution to that to bring it to the states? Look, I think that there's a very, very compelling case to be made for that. I don't think the argument that, well, this is a guy that's going to just take all this money and throw it out the window and, good luck getting sort of charity and private companies to do it. I think it's a disingenuous argument. I think there is a smart, sensible argument to be made that on a local level, people can pivot and respond to these crises in a better fashion.
One of the things I think about disaster is that you do want to start from the local level up, right? I mean, you want to start with the frontline people who are, the town sheriff and work your way up to the federal government. And
that's just how it happens anyway.
That's how it happens anyway. Yeah. That's the way it's structured. FEMA also, I mean, having a federal role in this, to me, is all about risk pooling, right? I mean, the point is that, certain areas are going to get hit by natural disasters more than others, and we want to kind of smooth out that risk across the pool of the citizens of the United States, and not to say to you, Gulf states, sorry, you get 2 hurricanes in a season, you're out of luck.
Some of those areas are poor.
Right.
They don't have the resources. And so in a great big country where there are some very wealthy people who can pay some taxes, it's kind of a good idea to collect up that money in case someplace where people don't have the resources. This is a logic of government. But I will say that if we back up a little bit on this, disasters like wars, like presidencies, like recessions, are big enough that we can all paint on them. Right? We can all put our picture on them. So I looked at this thing. I'm a very pro-labor person. So my response was, I'm watching union firefighters and union cops and union road crews up through the night, sweating, bleeding, putting out fires, wading through water, union nurses carrying kids to safety. And I'm saying, why does Mitt Romney bash these people? But now, in fairness, that's how I look at it. Right. You're going to look at it differently. And in a weird defense of Mitt Romney, he was answering a deficit question there. Right. He wasn't thinking about FEMA at all. And
in fact, he tried to dodge it a little bit.
And I think that's really crucial because for me, when I think about FEMA and disasters, I'm absolutely confronted by these two Americas, the Katrina FEMA reaction and the Sandy FEMA reaction. And the reality is to argue that there hasn't been a specific political response to the significance of FEMA by different governments and that it's not split down party lines is simply not true. Right. There was a really great article in Mother Jones that took you through
the development of FEMA's competence.
Yes, and who had headed FEMA. And the ways in which presidents had appointed those FEMA heads were directly related to how they perceived their significance. So, for example, George Bush actually allocated Michael Brown, who was the former... I just had to read this out because I was just blown away. Michael Brown, who was the former commissioner of judges and stewards for the International Arabian Horse Association. That's who headed FEMA. Clinton was the first president to allocate a FEMA head who actually had experience in disaster management. I say all of that to say that, of course, it's not just that it's political. It's that it's about poverty, it's about race, and when we think about disaster preparedness as well as recovery, the ways in which these two Americas break down, you see that again and again and again.
And it's also, I think, the other point here is that it's something that will happen, I think, often is people on the left, we get into this defensive crouch around the role of government, and so we defend the state's actions in the abstract. Right. But if you talk to lefty activists who were part of Common Ground in Katrina, it was government bureaucracy that was their enemy. Absolutely. And the folks right now in Staten Island who are frustrated and angry, and folks in housing projects down on the Lower East Side and who are angry and feeling like they're not getting enough attention, the target of that anger is the government bureaucracy, and you can't fall into the trap, I think, as a liberal, of saying, the state in the abstract, government has a role to play, and not also be very clear-eyed about the failures of specific bureaucratic performance, right?
So I was going to come back to this idea, you said risk pooling. Right. And I think that that's a really important question because we have to ask ourselves, does a storm like Katrina or Sandy, does it hit the United States? Right. Or does it hit New Orleans? Or does it hit New York? Does it hit a state? Or does it hit the United States? I think it hits the United States, and that's why, as a country, we actually do need to chip in and send the resources to help clean up. And that's why I find we can't afford to do this. We have borrowing $1.6 trillion to be offensive. Right. Because, of course, we got hit by a storm as a country. We have an obligation. But there's a second issue for the federal government, which is can they play a better role coordinating relief across the country, getting National Guard members to where they need to be, getting water where it needs to be. The states certainly are the ones who should say what they need. Right. But are they in a position to actually coordinate where it should come from and how it should get there? And I just don't think they are.
I think we've been shown an example even with Governor Christie talking about the speed at which President Obama reacted. Because, of course, you think about Katrina, you think about the slowness with which President Bush reacted. And speaking to that point, Romney doesn't think there's a United States. He thinks the 47% are the folks in New Orleans who don't deserve.
I don't know if that's a fair characterization.
I wouldn't say that.
But let me make my point, because I think you say that, but if you are living in those spaces, if you are living with the legacy of Katrina and you're in the 9th Ward, you would absolutely not say that that's an unfair argument, because you're still living with the legacy of the kind of unfairness that made you a refugee in your own country.
And that's the reality that you live in. You know why you need a federal government? You need a federal government because in some states there are governors that will not respond to some parts of their state, and you need somebody from the outside that will.
Or they will politicize the response to the degree where they don't get the help that they need.
To sort of agree with you, and actually against my own point in a way of sort of localizing these things, is that George Bush's disastrous performance in Katrina is something that nobody denies. I don't think anybody Republicans. But the local level performed disastrously too. Ray Nagin, et cetera.
Yeah.
So I mean,
and
let me tell you, the people that will tell you
that's
this.
an example. I think I think that's the point of it being the United States. How do you coordinate a reaction? It started with the example of the biggest. The president is the head of the biggest institution in this country. So who you are institutionally versus how individual Americans respond are two different realities. It's two different Americas.
I want to turn our attention to climate change because I think that was a story that foisted itself on the political discussion this week, I think for good, actually, in a way. Climate change and the politics of disaster. My story of the week is next. My story of the week. What's at stake? At about 8 p.m. on Monday night, the east-facing windows in my Brooklyn apartment started to bubble and buckle inward in a deeply unsettling way. The wind howled, and we thought it prudent to move ourselves away from the wall, expose the elements. But that one moment of sharp anxiety was as bad as things got. We were lucky. Our power never went out, and my neighborhood is on high enough ground it wasn't flooded by the storm surge. There were a few downed trees that took out parked cars, but that was about it. Just a few neighborhoods over, a young couple named Jesse Strike-Kest and Jacob Vogelman were out walking their dog at some point that evening when they were struck by a falling tree and killed. They are two of the estimated 109 people who've died due to the storm here in the U.S., a death toll that is mercifully lower than one might anticipate given the scale of the damage. Destruction is most evident here in New York City in Staten Island, in Queens' devastated coastal neighborhoods, and in the powerless precincts of Lower Manhattan, where cars roll through intersections without streetlights and commuters trundle over the bridges, walking over an East River whose waters overflowed its banks, filling the subway tunnels that connect the boroughs and rendering much of the system unusable. The MTA chairman said New York subways have, quote, never faced a disaster as devastating. It's very rare when the subways in the city don't run. But there is something simultaneously awful and exhilarating about those moments when normalcy is suspended. New Yorkers will still tell you about the solidarity and fellowship they shared with their neighbors on their stoops on the lightless nights of the 2003 blackout, or the comfort and aid they found in each other as they fled through the streets on foot, covered in dust, away from the falling towers. Obviously, the loss of life and intensity of trauma caused by Sandy is nowhere near the scale of 9/11. But it's fair to say the city hasn't been this devastated since that September day. And as many unsung civil servants and first responders and utility workers labor tirelessly to get the city running again, I'm reminded that one of the raw truths of 9/11 is that the first thing a competent government must do is protect its citizens. It can't protect them from everything, nor should it try. But we all recognized, I think, amidst the horror of 9/11, that we want our government first and foremost to keep us safe. The state cannot eliminate senseless death, but it is duty to reduce its likelihood. It's a conservative insight, really, the idea that government's job before all else is to keep its citizens secure, to protect them, that everything else comes after. And lefty that I am, I'm reminded in this moment that it contains an undeniable core truth. And yet, here we sit with a political system that could barely bring itself to acknowledge or discuss the tangible danger climate change poses to us, never mind undertake the massive, sustained effort necessary to combat and adapt to it. Andrew Cuomo, as careful a politician as you'll see, tried to note the elephant in the room without ever naming it.
There has been a series of extreme weather incidents. Anyone that's not a political statement, that is a factual statement. Anyone who says there's not a dramatic change in weather patterns, I think is denying reality.
In his endorsement of President Obama this week, New York Mayor Michael Bloomberg wrote, "In just 14 months, 2 hurricanes have forced us to evacuate neighborhoods, something our city government had never done before. If this is a trend, it is simply not sustainable." No, it's not sustainable. Things that can't go on don't. It's true. Sandy was a freak storm, a bad luck confluence of a number of low probability events that could conceivably have happened in some alternate climate that wasn't warming. But this climate, our climate, is warming. And as it does, low probability events like this will become more probable and more intense. Carbon emissions are trapping extra energy in our atmosphere, and with extra energy come more extremes. Higher sea levels, drier droughts, hotter heat waves, and heavier, wetter storms. We need a crash program in this country right now to re-engineer the nation's infrastructure to cope with and prepare for the climate disruptions that we have already ensured with the carbon we've already put into the atmosphere, as well as an immediate, aggressive transformation of our energy production, economy, and society to reduce the amount of carbon we will put into the atmosphere in the future. This is as fundamental, as elemental as human endeavors get. The story of civilization is the long tale of crusaders for order battling the unceasing reality of chaos. And it is a kind of miracle that we have succeeded as much as we have, that airplanes fly through the air and roads plunge beneath the water, and the entire teeming latticework of human life exists in the manifold, improbable places it does. But it is the grand irony that in imposing this improbable order on the world, we've released millions of years of stored-up carbon into the atmosphere, which is now altering the climate and threatening the very monuments of civilization that we so cherish. We absolutely have it within us, collectively, to beat back the forces of chaos once again. But we must choose to do so. And the time for choosing is now. You are either on the side of your fellow citizens and residents of this planet, or you are on the side of the storms as yet unnamed. You cannot be neutral. So which side are you on? All right, joining us at the table now is Klaus Jacob, a research scientist at Columbia University's Earth Institute, and Eric Klinenberg, returning to the table, author of Heatwave, A Social Autopsy of Disaster in Chicago, and a professor of sociology at New York University. Klaus, I wanted to have you here because the New York Times ran a piece recently, and this is the headline. It says, climate change, New York is lagging as seas and risks rise, critics warn. And it was about the fact that the city was exposed to increased risks as climate change brought sea level up. And it quotes you, a report that you did in 2009. And this is your prediction about what would happen if there was a storm with a sufficiently high storm surge, just a foot higher, I believe, than Irene. Just about. And you said, if the surge had been just that much higher, subway tunnels would have flooded, segments of the FDR and roads along the Hudson River would have turned into rivers, and sections of the commuter rail system would have been impassable or bereft of power. The most vulnerable systems, like subway tunnels under the Harlem and East Rivers, would have been unusable for nearly a month or longer at an economic loss of about $55 billion. This is, I think, eerily prescient. So I want you to tell me, what were the circumstances under which you undertook this report talking about what the vulnerabilities of New York City were?
Well, in about 2009, first Mayor Bloomberg, and then later the state, through its agency called NYSERDA, charged a group of scientists to look at the consequences of climate change and how New York City on the one hand, and New York State, on the other hand, should adapt to it. As part of that study, in the NYSERDA study, we were making a case study in which we had a 100-year flood or storm surge hitting New York City. And with a lot of help of the engineering department students at Columbia University, we came up with a very detailed analysis, and it showed that the subway tunnels would flood within 40 minutes, and so on. It was eerily, incredibly true what happened 4 days ago, right down to the detail that the Brooklyn Battery Tunnel would be entirely flooded, the Queens Midtown Tunnel only partly flooded. I mean, it's terrible to be right. The point is here that this is information that was available 1 to 2 years ago.
Yeah.
And it shows that just producing scientific, technical results is not enough.
Right.
The political process has not taken notice of the information that we were charged to produce for them.
This is the fundamental issue that we have up and down this issue specifically on climate, but also disaster, right, Eric? I mean, you can go back and you can read reports, and I did reports about what would happen if a storm hit New Orleans and a storm surge pushed over the levees, and the problems that would happen in the Ninth Ward, and the evacuation problems, and everything down the line, written 2 or 3 years before Katrina actually happened, and the political infrastructure did not make the governing choices that would have prevented it.
We act as if we have a will not to know about these dangers, and when we're warned of them, we freak out. We don't know what to do. We get overwhelmed and scared. We've just gone through 3 presidential debates in which the concept of climate change never came up once. This was Mother Nature speaking back and saying, I will be heard. You have something to reckon with. Unfortunately, we now live in a moment where this debate will become inescapable. And the silver lining that could come out of this is that this could be the kind of event or historic experience that becomes a turning point, that makes a conversation about climate change a fundamental part of conversations about security and governance.
One of the things we talk about with climate, we talk about carbon mitigation, and there's all sorts of things about cap and trade and a carbon tax. But I think one of the things Sandy's highlighted, and your work, Klaus, has highlighted, is that in parallel to that, we also have to take a hard look at how we are engineering our cities and creating a kind of resiliency in these massive population centers. So I want to talk about how we need to be thinking about that right after we take this quick break. We're talking about the politics of disaster and resiliency. And Klaus, there was a point you wanted to make before I went to break about how we think about not only climate carbon mitigation, but also engineering and cities and population centers and our natural landscape to make sure that we reduce our risks.
Well, first we have to understand the hazard before we can deal with the risk and then engineer. We should remember that what we have seen in terms of a storm surge 4 days ago, this will be the sea level on a nice, sunny, wind-still day by the year 2100. So that gives you a reference frame.
Right.
Now, on top of it, you will have storms. Right. Okay. So, what does this mean? It means that coastal areas, everything that is roughly 5 feet plus whatever tides you have higher, needs to be looked at it from a land use or urban planning use. So either we protect entire cities like New Orleans tried, and I'm having to say later on maybe something about that, because I think if we build barriers for New York City, we have to have an exit strategy, because those barriers will not last forever with rising sea level.
That's grim.
Which means we have to do something behind the barriers anyhow to protect us, just like New Orleans was unprepared when the barriers failed. So we have to prepare for what we do when the barriers fail.
Preparing for failure is a huge part of disaster preparation. It's one of the things that's amazing in your book about the heat wave, is that you begin to see systems fail. Electricity goes down, then the cell phone network, it gets overused, and water doesn't work in high rises. How do you prepare for failure?
Well, you have to prepare for systems to be resilient, which means you need to invest in infrastructure. You need to update the grid, for instance. Every time there's a heat wave in this country, every summer, the power goes out, and in some cases for days. You know, one barometer of the extent to which climate change is increasing the number of extreme events is I find myself getting called more and more every year because these events are regular. You also need to build up structures to provide support and care. Too often our conversations about these issues are exclusively engineering and physical science kinds of questions. Those matter, no doubt. They're fundamental. But there is a social dimension to this as well. Which neighborhoods are affected? Which individual people are affected? And it's predictable.
Fascinating. Zone A, which is the part of New York City, was evacuated, low-lying. Residents there were twice as likely to be residents of public housing as New York more broadly, which I thought was an interesting look into that. I want to bring in Democratic Congressman Ed Markey of Massachusetts. He's a ranking member of the House Natural Resources Committee, a senior member of the House Energy and Commerce Committee, and co-sponsor of the only climate bill to ever pass a chamber of Congress. Congressman, what is your reaction to the stunning absence of this issue that you worked so hard on and labored over and ground out a large bill with tons of technical details that people took hard votes on, and it has now disappeared from the political conversation?
Well, I think that Mother Nature decided that she was going to inject it into this election. If it wasn't going to be raised in any of the debates, then she was going to find a way of having this be discussed. And so this election for next Tuesday is now framed. It's Mother Nature versus the unrestrained use of oil and coal and other polluting sources. I think the public now sees what the consequences are of having this issue just be ignored. It's no longer just some abstract issue that might be affecting the Arctic. What's happening in the Arctic is now affecting the weather here on the East Coast and all across the United States. And so it's now an issue. And I think that it's really got Mitt Romney on the defensive, as he should be, because the Mitt Romney who was the governor of Massachusetts, my home state, he believed in climate science. But the Mitt Romney who runs for the Republican nomination for president in 2012, he cannot believe in climate science. He has to make jokes about it in order to get the nomination of one of the most important historical parties in our country's history, and that is a sad state of scientific affairs.
Mayor Bloomberg, in his endorsement of the president, basically the key to the endorsement was the position on climate change, and he talked about the choices being between candidates. One sees climate change as an urgent problem that threatens our planet. One does not. I want our president to place scientific evidence and risk management above electoral politics. President Bill Clinton and Ronald Reagan both found success while their parties were out of power in Congress, and President Obama can too. Here's my question to you, and we'll talk about Mitt Romney in a second, but I want to talk about President Obama. He himself has not done a lot to talk about climate on this on the campaign trail. It's probably going to be a Republican House. I believe the stakes in this election are between one candidate who accepts the science of global warming and one who hedges on it. But what is the real difference between the policy that we can see? Convince me that if I'm a climate voter, that my vote is going to matter on Tuesday.
Oh, my goodness. Mitt Romney says that he's going to roll back the requirement that the fuel economy standards of the vehicles which we drive go to 54.5 miles per gallon by the year 2026. If he rolls that back, that's equal to 6 billion metric tons of CO2 going up into the atmosphere. That's one whole year of total CO2 from the United States. Obama is committed to moving forward on that. And by the way, that also backs out 3 million barrels of oil, all of the oil which we import from the Persian Gulf on a daily basis. On December 31st of this year, Romney says he's going to allow all the wind tax breaks to expire. So the wind industry is going to collapse in our country, even though 12,000 new megawatts of wind have been installed in the United States this year alone. And Barack Obama says he's going to extend them and give the same kind of breaks to solar going out into the future. The president's EPA is looking at the regulation of greenhouse gases, and Mitt Romney is saying absolutely not. So issue after issue, one after another, there is a big dividing line between these two people. And for anyone who thinks that there will be no difference if they elect one or the other on this issue, they could not be more wrong. Okay, this is a stark difference, and it's going to actually impact how many people in the future die, how many people in the future have their lives changed unalterably by climate change here in the United States, not around the world, here in our country.
Congressman, there's a bunch of questions for you here at the table. I want to take a quick break and then bring you in the discussion right after this.
President Obama promised to begin to slow the rise of the oceans. And to heal the planet. My promise is to help you and your family.
That was Mitt Romney pausing for laughter in talking about the sea level rise at the RNC, which is a really shocking moment to me. Esther Arma, you had a question you wanted to ask Congressman Markey.
I did. Listening to this, I think one of the big challenges is the degree to which the science has become so politicized that evidence matters less than which party politician is articulating what may happen with climate change. That when I hear you talk about on a sunny day in 2100 we're going to see the seas and the storm rise, I literally hear a Hollywood movie featuring Tom Cruise or Will Smith. Do you know what I mean? There's an element on the ground where it's become so politicized. How does that move? Events matter because they create connection, and it humanizes something that has felt abstract. And it's felt like, with all due respect to you, that it's something that older white men talk about. It doesn't affect the majority of people, and so there isn't the connection. What Sandy does is make it immediate, specific, direct, and targeted. So I want to ask the Congressman and you about the evidence shows you knew this was going to happen, and so therefore what happens in 2100 is specific as well. But how do you move beyond the politics so that people pressure makes this more potential legislation?
Congressman, where is there any hope of any forward movement in, say, a House dominated by the Republican Party for political movement on this?
Look at Congress is a stimulus response institution, and there's nothing more stimulating than watching night after night, day after day, millions of people paralyzed along the East Coast. This is going to have the same impact that 9/11 had on how we protect ourselves here domestically. It's going to have the same impact that the BP oil spill had in ensuring that we don't ever again have the same lax safety standards in oil drilling off our coastline. This is a game changer, and I agree with what the gentleman said, because this is no longer just a Hollywood blockbuster the day after tomorrow. This is now a blockbuster storm which actually hit. So the day after tomorrow is now today. It's in New York, it's in New Jersey, it's in Connecticut, and people are watching this each day. And there won't be any jokes about climate change again. There won't be any dismissal of this. Now, it won't stop the oil industry. It won't stop the coal industry from trying to block legislation. But I think moderate Republicans in the Congress, above the Mason-Dixon line, are never again going to be allowed to just laugh along with these jokesters from coal country and pretending that climate change is not real.
Democratic Congressman Ed Markey, thanks for joining us this morning. More on this when we come back.